David Picciuto. It's all David Picciuto's fault. 3 years ago, David made a video showing how he made some pencils out of scrap wood, and he meticulously went through a process of getting that hexagonal shape, and I just thought, man, that is really cool. Wouldn't it be great if there was a tool that made this easier so that you could use your scrap wood to make a cool gift for next to nothing? Man, it would just be the most awesome thing in the world if there was a tool to let woodworkers make pencils. I set out to try to do that. And as you'll see, that is a big part of why I don't post videos more often. It's taken a lot of my time behind the scenes. So the first idea starts out with a router bit that cuts a half circle in a starting blank. And actually, this idea is the one that carried through to all the subsequent iterations of a pencil making jig, but we'll get to that later. After cutting that half circle into each side of a blank, I rip it down with a bandsaw and glue a piece of lead in the middle so that I have a piece of lead embedded in a pencil blank. Now it gets more challenging when you try to take that rectangular shaped pencil blank and turn it into a hexagon. So my first idea started with a lathe step. I would chuck this up on some specially made lathe headstock and tailstock tools and turn it down to a cylinder with the right diameter to fit into the next tool. And this really ended up being the Achilles heel, the problem with this process. It was just too fiddly a step to be making. That thin pencil wanted to flex. It just was too much to ask people to recreate. But the way this process worked, the next step was to force that cylinder through that hexagonal extrusion plate that I just showed. And it did work. After, if a lot of care was taken in making that cylinder on the lathe, and you tapped it through this hexagonal form, you did end up with a pretty decent pencil shape. It was just not quite user-friendly enough to really be a viable product. And beyond that, it wasn't even finished after this step. You had to clean up those faces on sandpaper. It didn't come out of that extrusion plate perfectly formed. It took some more shaping and working. Not the end of the world, but it added some time to an already pretty tedious process. And it took me a while to realize that this really wasn't a winner. I spent a lot of time refining this design and even thinking about how I would bring it to market. And, do I want to do it on my own? Do I want to license it to someone? All those kind of development thoughts before I came to terms with the fact that this really wasn't a viable way to go. So lots of time spent. The next idea was a pure router solution. The idea was to cut half of the hexagonal form in the blank after milling in the half circle recess, just have an all router process. And I didn't get as far as actually prototyping this. I tried something that was geometrically sort of similar, and it did end up working. If I made a climbing cut, this is just kind of a half circle router bit just to kind of test the mechanics of making a cut like this, and it worked out. The problem is you need perfect zero clearance registration with this fence and the router bit. So if you have the router bit set just a little bit, and by a little bit I mean thousandth of an inch too high or too low, you're chewing into the fence and damaging it. And similarly, you need to have the distance between the fence and the router bit exactly perfect. It was just too rigorous and too perfect a setup to realistically expect people to be doing on their router tables. So I had to scrap this one too and go a completely different direction. Okay, so this next process uses a flush trim bit, and the pencil blank is held on both sides and presented to the flush trim bit in such a way that a flat face can be cut, and then the tool rotates 60 degrees so that the next face is presented to the bit. So this looks pretty good, right? After you do this 6 times, you have 6 faces of the hexagon perfectly cut around the center lead, and you end up with a pretty good pencil. It really worked quite well. The problem is you have a powerful bit and this piece of wood hanging out there, and it tended to break occasionally. Now this was a little better for climbing cuts, but climbing cuts have their own issues associated with them, the feedback and kind of kickback that you can have. It was a liability issue. I had to go a different route. But I didn't have to scrap things entirely this time. The idea of holding the blank at each end and rotating 60 degrees to cut the faces of the hexagon, that was pretty good. I just needed something safer than a router bit to be doing that cutting. And as you see here, I'm using a hand plane to make those cuts. So I know that when the hand plane bottoms out on the 2 sides of the track, that I've cut that face to the right depth, and it's time to rotate 60 degrees. Now this whole flip up concept, I thought that was necessary. I ended up engineering it out later on and making this a lot simpler, but you get the idea. You make a cut, when it bottoms out on the sides, you rotate 60 degrees and repeat that process until you have all 6 sides of the pencil cut. So this is the refined version. It really works quite well. In about 4.5 minutes, I'm able to take the starting blank and turn it into a pencil. So pretty quick process, very safe with a hand plane, and it's really only limited by how sharp you can get the blade. It cuts acrylic and wood and really works great. So I got there. I also made 2 more videos that you can see here. This one is an instruction video, how to use the jig, with more detail than I showed in this video. And in this video, I show how I make a really cool pencil out of colored pencils. And David Picciuto is actually helping me get the word out on this. You can check out his video here. So take a look at all that stuff. Hope you enjoyed. I'll see you next time.